And thanks everybody for coming. I know you're all very busy and taking time out of your day. So let me start. I'm going to talk about just a little bit of stuff here. And I do these talks pretty often. And one of the cool things about doing these is that you kind of go back over where you've been and what you do and the kind of artist that you are. I kind of go all the way back. So Tragicomic Contraptions was actually the title of my thesis when I was in grad school in the 90s. So you sort of, at least I sort of get like thinking about how little my art has changed over those years. But as you look through it, you see how much you've grown and things that you've done and gone in unexpected places. And so, but I still think that my work carries a lot of those same aspects of absurdity and sort of like the element of humor and sadness. And so I feel like that's still a fitting title for this talk. So I'm gonna go on now and start with my stuff. So Hildy, you mentioned a few of these things. One of the things that I think kind of impacts a lot of my work is that I'm the first person in my family to ever go to college. I went on a full academic scholarship for pre-med. And then in my sophomore year, I changed to art, much to the chagrin of my scholarship committee. And they were a little afraid that I would starve. And there's a lot of chagrin at that point. But I think that they've realized now that I've done okay with what I'm doing. So the things I made back then were big toy-like things that had sort of like an irony to them. And they were meant to be sort of fun, but also sort of sad, scary at the same time. And I still am doing, 20 or more years later, that same basic thing. So I went on to get an MFA at UMASS Dartmouth, and that was in sculpture. Now I teach woodworking and 3D design, but a lot of that sculpture stuff still kind of bleeds through. Some of my works are actually physically interactive. That is, I allow viewers to turn cranks and press buttons and stuff. But I'm really looking to engage viewers intellectually and visually with the work. So I try to make stuff that makes people think, as well as sort of have like a visual joy or play with the things. As you mentioned, Hilda, I've been lucky enough to have a lot of exhibitions and then also in all of the 50 states. So that's something that took a long time to achieve. So I'm really happy with that. And a couple of years ago, I went over 100 awards for both my art and teaching. So I've been blessed in that way. So the things I teach are mainly woodworking, furniture, 3D design, and then also I'm going to start teaching an official sculpture class this semester, which should be fairly fun. So things that I look at to make my work. One of the things that's kind of cool about an artist talk is that sometimes they let you in on the stuff that kind of fuels their work, because a lot of times you just see the thing, you say, wow, that's weird, where'd that come from? So I'm really into absurdity, Beckett, tragicomedy, that kind of stuff. My favorite artist ever is H.C. Westerman, who's a Chicago artist, sort of lesser known, like not a super famous artist because he was difficult to fit into a specific category, but an amazing craftsman, maker, thinker, just a great, great artist. I've always been a big fan of mythology, especially Greek and Roman, but also other sort of milieu of mythologies as well. So you'll see some of that come up in the work. One of my favorite kinds of art is folk art, especially American folk art. So when I go to a new museum or a new place that has art on display, I try to go see the folk art first because I think it has sort of an honesty and a character that fine art with a capital F and a capital A doesn't often have. So there's that. And then there's a lot of people who make stuff now that I really like Jason Walker, who's a ceramics artist from Washington State, Gord Peterin, who's a Canadian maker. It's hard to really define exactly what he does because it's kind of like furniture-ish. The IFF, which is two women in San Francisco who do these incredible objects that use knitting and crochet techniques to make visual, previously thought unvisualizable math concepts, which is really amazing stuff. They made this whole life-size crocheted coral reef, which kind of blew my mind. And then also, one sec, let me go back to, let's see. Okay, cool. And Katie Hudnall, who is an artist who now teaches at UW-Madison. So, wait, okay, cool. Let's see. Okay, so a lot of the themes that come up in my work include flying. I have recurring dreams of flying. I just had one a couple nights ago, actually. And I've done a lot of images about Icarus and Greek myths of flying and falling like Talos. So those are some that kind of come up. And that imagery kind of comes from the idea of futility, tragicomedy, and then sort of flight as a metaphor for transcendence. So here's just some of the works. This is a piece called Icarus in a Wetsuit, which if you know the story, it's kind of like meant to be sort of like a humorous take on Icarus knowing that he was going to go into the ocean before he left. It has a little crank on top that you turn, and it has these cool kind of little wax wings that flop up and down. It's covered in rubber. Here's a piece that's meant to fit my body dimensions. So the idea of this precocious utilitarian is someone who kind of like is building stuff, understands that this will never allow true transcendence, but attempts nonetheless. So it's like this wearable thing with these two cranks in front that you turn. And then there's these two wings that flap and then stones that drag it down. This is one of the first pieces.
Rob, hold on 1 second.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Someone is sharing their screen that's not you.
Oh, sorry. Oh, am I not on?
Somehow it's share. Does anybody see Rob work, or do you see a Zoom that's going up and down scrolling? Okay, owner is sharing their screen. I don't know who that is.
Okay, do you want me to go?
Okay, so people are not seeing what you're talking about.
Oh, shoot.
So
Okay.
let's figure that out. Hold on.
Okay.
I kept thinking I lost something on mine, and then somebody texted that. I was like in a freak mode, but
okay.
freak out mode. Let's see. So when somebody's sharing, allowing you to share your screen, which option do you usually click on? Do you share at one time, or do you know?
I don't host enough of these meetings to know exactly.
I'm usually not the one running them, so I don't know about.
I actually host a fair amount. Usually you, as long as you've only made a certain number of co-hosts, only co-hosts should be able to share their screen. So if it's not Rob's screen, it's probably some other co-host.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Marilyn.
Okay, thank you. Fred? Sorry, guys.
Well, it's possible that it might be me, I suppose, because I've been trying to do things. Well, I'm not moving that, though. Are you moving it? Who's moving it?
The person their name is owner. So if you can you make him co-host, Fred, and then only co-host can share.
I think her name is Elsa.
Elsa.
Oh, hey, Ben.
Hey.
Thanks, Ben.
She's in trouble. You guys have to hear Elsa laugh.
Make Elsa a co-host? Is that what I'm doing?
No. Make Rob a co-host.
Okay.
Sorry, guys. This is the beauty of electronics.
All right, I can close that up and then go back to Zoom. Oh, okay. All right, 1 second.
I'll tell you when I see your stuff.
Okay, let me bring this up. Share screen.
Well, I'm glad we practiced, Fred.
Well, we had a plan.
Yeah, we did.
Do you see?
We still see the Zoom person.
All right, 1 second. Let me bring this up.
Owner may have to stop share for the
Rob
to be able to share.
Okay.
So you think Elsa is sharing, Carol?
Well, if I'm.
Okay.
I don't want to close that up, though.
Okay.
No? Yeah? Oh. Well, Rob, would you like to talk about Zoom and join a meeting? What is your thought? It's a very conceptual work. I like the yellow scribbles on top.
Maybe it would be. There you go.
Is that good?
Flying, falling, floating?
Yes. Is that on now?
Yay!
Cool. Good. Awesome. Great. Thank you.
Awesome.
Gosh. Sorry about the tech problems, you guys. Okay.
Who solved
the
it?
meeting if that didn't happen?
Okay. Good. Cool. Okay. So this is the one that I was on next. Talos is a piece about Talos, who is a nephew of Daedalus, sort of a not oft-told Greek myth, because Daedalus ends up become really jealous of this 12-year-old kid and pushes him off of a really high building and kills him. But one of the gods sees Talos as this really special child, so she transforms him into a bird, and he's able to fly away from this. And anyway, there's a whole story that goes along with this. But so here's a piece where I've used lead and concrete in a piece that's about lightness and flight, which is meant to be sort of ironic. I was invited to do a show a piece for a show about kites. And I thought to myself, what's like the biggest, heaviest, most unkite-like object there could be? So I made this really giant anvil kite, which is sort of, I call it Acme anvil kite, because it's kind of like a sort of a Looney Tunes, like Tex Avery-esque kind of joke about kites and heavy things. Then I have a bunch of masks that I've made. So this is something that I kind of feel like I've been doing these for as long as I've been making art. You know, the first one happened a really, really long time ago, and I'm still working on 2 of these in the studio right now. So looking at these, I think about personae, the different people that you are in different situations, and how those are all different parts of you. Masking traditions are really interesting, and visually there's something that basically every culture on earth has made some kind of a mask. So seeing that breadth of different kinds of influences is something that really has touched me in the past. Some of these are wearable masks, but they're almost always really uncomfortable. And I think that's sort of about how changing oneself for different scenarios can sometimes be difficult. So that is sort of metaphorically built into these. And then I have a lot of interest in, especially African masking is something that is incredibly rich visually, and it's really storied. And there's so much that comes into the work because of the formal influences, but also the really depth of the mythology that it goes along with. And there's also tramp art, which some people may have seen before. It's made out of these stacked old pieces of cigar boxes. So just to kind of give you a sense of where one of these pieces kind of comes from, this is a Keith Webe mask. And the really cool thing about this one is that when you put it on, the only way that you can see people is by literally looking down upon them. So it has this really cool aspect of the function that it has, but also how it places one in different social strata. And I really dug that idea of how it has that sort of a physical accompaniment that goes along with. And one thing about this mask, and a lot of masks that you see on display as sort of Western objects are denuded a lot of their volume. Like you see all these little holes that happen on the sides of this. Those would have been filled with raffia and excelsior and like really massive, puffy, volumetric things that are no longer there. So it's almost like, you know, looking at a Pomeranian dog that you shaved. You know, it doesn't have any of the mass that it should have. So what we're looking at is really like half an object almost. But that said, the strong forms in this are things that influenced me to go on and make pieces like this. So this is called Highbrow Mask, which is a really big piece. And it's displayed really high up on the wall. So it kind of looks down on you. And then at the same time, it has this long mouth that kind of comes down and like just sort of whispers at you at eye level. Here's a really cool piece of tramp art. So this was made of lots of different kinds of cigar boxes were taken apart. A lot of times cigar boxes would be made out of like tropical woods, like mahogany. So they would be disassembled and then cut with a chip carving knife as you sort of rode the rails and just kind of killed time during the Depression. Then they'd stack these together to make functional objects that they could sell or trade for food or places to stay. Being influenced by this and sort of that stacking quality led to a whole bunch of masks like this one, Critical Mask. This one's also influenced by being a teacher, especially in the arts, and taking what's normally a very subjective experience and trying to give it a numerical grade, which is always really challenging. So this led to a whole series of these masks made out of these measuring sticks. Unable to see over the hegemony. So this one has, I happened to find an old abandoned piano that had real ivory keys that I was able to salvage those from there. So I made these literal ivory towers that sort of block its ability to see. It has this kind of cartoonish fist that comes out that's armed with this little mallet stuff. Conversation in a Small Boat mask. This one, you can't see it in the image, but up on top of the crenellated part at the top area, it has this little tiny boat. And this came from, I've always been really into philosophy. And I was listening to this great course about philosophy, and they were talking about Hegel, and the professor who was doing the course joked about how, you know, he was at this conference with these people talking about Hegel. And he's like, you know, if we were all in a tiny boat and it sang, like half of the really deep knowledge about Hegel in the world would disappear, you know, which I thought was really an interesting idea of how academic conversations can be so deep, but so narrow on a bandwidth. So this sort of creature has these two mouths that kind of come out and talk right to its own ears. And this is, so some of these pieces are pretty, I don't mean to slam academia. I'm in it. I am part of it. So It's all self-deprecating as well. Phaethon, it's a story about Phaethon. He was a son of Apollo, but he wasn't claimed. So Phaethon was like kind of a scrawny kid being made fun of all the time on the, just like, you know, out in the yard, and kids would say, yeah, and he'd be like, and he was finally, his mom prevailed upon Apollo to claim Phaethon, and Apollo was like, oh, you know, I officially accept you as one of my sons, and I'll give you anything you want. And Phaethon was like, yeah, let me ride the sun chariot across the sky. And Apollo's like, you really don't want that. And he's like, no, I do want that. And of course, he like becomes scorched to a crisp as he's driving this chariot made out of fire. He crashes it on the earth, and there's a whole story that goes along with this. So the NASA allegory part is from when I was a young kid in my 7th grade classroom. I like will never forget the experience at the time that we saw the Challenger disaster happen. You know, the internet didn't exist. You couldn't just go to Live Leak and watch people perish at any time you wanted. It was like a really powerful thing to have seen, you know, those people just basically die right in front of us on TV, and have our teacher turn off the TV and say, yeah, we're going to stop watching now, you know? So this idea of sort of human hubris, the desire to transcend, and how that's something that humans have always kind of taken on. So that led to a mask like this. Here's a really neat Southern possum mask. So when you look at this one, it has these really amazing aggressive filed teeth. The bits at the top sort of emulate these really beautiful braided sort of like fist-like blobs that are that the hair styles are braided into, which is really neat. And then there's mace-like piece that kind of comes off of the goatee at the bottom. These are really powerful masks to see, and I could talk a lot more about these, but I only have to do 1 minute per slide. But looking at these influenced me to make a series of these more aggressive masks. So this one has sort of like a table saw blade-like face, and then these really angry mouths. It sort of talks up out both sides of its face. And it's about aggressive people, basically. Tends to lash out. This is kind of a self-portrait, because at times I don't always handle my anger as well as I could. So this is sort of like a commentary on how I can sometimes be. And it's a mask, a wearable full-size mask that's made completely out of mouse traps, and it also has that sort of that cartoonish fist that comes out. Empiricist masks. This is one that was based on empiricism, and this is sort of like how philosophy kind of flows in to the work at times. There's a lot of a pretty obvious influence here from sort of Hindu art, multiple sensitive organs here, nose, and like a lot of the sensate organs here become multiplied and extended in size and shape. Kind of an interesting piece. This is Refuge Mask. This is about doomsday preppers, and sadly, this has become a little bit more relevant in the last year or so. That this is a wearable mask. I can put it on. It has these shoulder pad like forms that come over, and when you put it on, you're very insulated and sort of like disconnected from everywhere outside you, but you can barely see. There's 2 cute little pit bulls that live in the front yard of this. Handmade shingles and a lot of like tiny, very, very small detail here, which is something that I really get into. I currently live in the sacrificial zone, or a sacrificial zone, which is a part of the United States that people care very little about. Like so much coal ash is dumped into our water, and it's just sort of everything upstream just dumps the stuff, and it's gotten worse over the last 4 years. Again, I'm trying to stay as apolitical as possible, but it's very difficult in my work. So I moved here 13 years ago, and this has real coal up on top. It's a really sort of a model there of this giant coal mining machine. Inside the mask, there's these 2 forms here that are shaped kind of like lungs, but also shaped like smokestack-like emissions. And then this object down here coming out of the mouth is actually like a coal mining drill. It's an amazing, it looks almost like a lamprey or like a remora, kind of like a evil fish with toothy mouths. And so alchemy is something that I really got into kind of early on in my mask making career. I think about lead versus gold and how those 2 things look, like the dullness of lead versus the brightness of gold, and the idea of transmutation. And I think about how art takes like very common everyday objects and creates an experience that is sort of ineffable. So I made several of these alchemy pieces. This is Alchemist Mask. It's a wearable work. When you're wearing it, you can look out of it and see this man chasing this golden goose. But if you're inside the mask, you can't actually tell that they can't catch one another. So it's sort of this feeling of like attempting to futility and that kind of stuff. And then I have apparatus for unrequitedness. So this is a similar piece where you kind of get in behind it, look through the eye holes, and you see this really delicious golden carrot that kind of like sits right in your field of vision. But since you're wearing these wrist cuffs, every time you go to grab it, it kind of goes out of your vision and you're unable to reach it. So this sort of plays off the tragicomic idea and futility. Then I have a lot of figures and puppets. So this is a theme that I've touched on quite a bit in my past. I'm also working on some pieces like this even now. So mythology, I think about like everyday situations kind of mixed into these. I like to display them so that when you're looking at them, you see them pretty much at eye level. And it's a way of kind of like connecting the viewer and the object fairly directly to start with. And then here's a couple of examples. So here's Illuminated Man. This is a piece that was on display at Ball State. This is probably, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 years ago now, a long time ago. But so the figure here is sort of like has a mythological basis. So the figure is kind of like out in the Zeus and or Poseidon pose, holding this cruise missile. So it's meant to be sort of like a commentary on foreign policy under certain presidents where, you know, like this sort of death from above would just sort of like arrive like a lightning bolt. And the arms and the cruise missile are both made out of ash, or all made out of ash, which is like a traditional wood that was used by the Greeks to make their javelins and spears. So that's sort of like maybe that's in there for all the wood nerds out there, but it's also meaningful to me. It's also a lamp, so it's partially illuminated. But one of the fun things about this piece that you can't see is that the head is actually cut off from all the light, so it's totally dim. And it's also filled with a motorized box of rocks that turns at about 1 RPM. So like it kind of goes thud, 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 thud. Anyway, so it's one of my attempts at dry humor. Here's a piece about conflict resolution, and I made a series of works. I only put in one of them about rock, paper, scissors and conflict resolution. So these are 3 smallish puppets, and each of them kind of like presents, it's sort of like a commentary on like how one thing beats another, and how this sort of like this, it's like a circle of losing and winning, and how those things can kind of interact over time. Kind of a fun piece. I did a self-portrait as a critic. This is done for a self-portrait show. I was kind of in a ruler phase at that time. It has 2 eyes. One is the eye, which is like a sign language eye, but then the figure itself only has 1 eye. So it has 2 eyes, but they each block one another off and sort of like obscure each other. So those are kind of like little bits of things that I put in there almost for myself as a joke when I'm working. Under Yellow Flag is a piece that I made about quarantining. And this was before Corona. It's actually based on the quarantine that Venice used to try to stay safe during the Black Plague. So you have this plague doctor-like guy with a hat and these glass eyes. There's a moat, a little water moat that goes around the outside, and then this tiny boat. And one of the ways that they would mark off a house then, if someone was quarantined inside, is these big red X's. So it's sort of like a play off of those things. And then the yellow flag there is the flag of quarantine. So like that's one of the ways that they also attempted to keep Venice safe from the plague. Inside of the bird cage is this little tiny yellow canary, which has some obvious metaphorical stuff going on. Here's a piece I made about Kant. So I really think Kant is very interesting to read. I think at times his work can be a little bit thick, but I've always really enjoyed sort of the depth of his work, and also how much applicability it still has to stuff that we do today, which is kind of interesting because he was writing a long time ago, and his philosophy, some parts of it at least, have really stood up. So this piece is based partially on, Kant was very famous for taking these walks. So he would take these walks through Königsberg, which was the name of the city that he lived in then. And people could like literally set their watch by his walks. They were so like a consistent every day. In fact, the day that he died, like a bunch of people were like, oh, where's Kant today? He's missing, you know, like they knew that something had happened, really bad had happened to Kant that day because he didn't make his walk. The city of Königsberg had these 7 bridges, and so the idea of these scales of justice with a black and a white and a white and a black. Anyway, so there's a lot that kind of goes into this. Like, I don't want to explain every single choice unless people want to know. Here's a piece that's now owned by Indiana State University. So it's one that I made kind of early on in the Trump years. And it's based on the Women's March and sort of like some of the unrest that happened early on in the Trump presidency. I've taken a really famous piece by George Lopez, which is an archangel killing a demon. I think many of you have seen it before. And Lopez was famous for doing this naked style where he would like work with the wood and not do much to it. He would sort of like leave it as a woody kind of a quality. So I did the same thing with this, and I gave this female angel figure wings and this nice pussy hat, and this she's sort of slaying this demon that has one tiny left wing and one oversized right wing. I think maybe that's a little heavy-handed. He's also has golf cleats on, if you can tell. Snug the Joiner. So this is a figurative piece that I did a bit about A Midsummer Night's Dream. So in the last couple of years, I finished my master's designation at Mark Adams School of Woodworking, and this is a piece that I made for that project. So A Midsummer Night's Dream is one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. I've always really enjoyed it. So one of the characters in it, one of the rude mechanicals is Snug the Joiner. And as part of his costume, he has sort of this really crappy, he wears this really badly made lion costume, which this is meant to be about. He's holding 2 traditional joiners pieces of equipment there, a mallet, and then also a hand plane. This was really fun to make because it ties together so much stuff I like Snug the Joiner. A joiner is like a woodworker in England. Jacobean sculpture and also woodwork was something that kind of influenced the lion-like feet that happened on this, and carving those was just so fun to do. A little tedious, but really fun to do. A lot of people don't do that kind of carving anymore, and once I finished these 4 pieces carved out of cherry, I recognized why. It's really, really arduous. Even with power tools, I was like, man. Anyway, but the drawer here holds a copy of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I found a really good copy of it that had this light green cover, which I feel like I really scored with because the red of the cherry wood is so warm, and having that pop of green when you open up this drawer down below, I thought was just a really delicious kind of contrast between the 2 things. The handle of the drawer is based on a kind of chisel that they would use in the Jacobean era, Jacobean, sorry. And then also the little bit that you see at the bottom here, A Midsummer Night's Dream has a play within a play about Pyramus and Thisbe, and I don't know if you guys know that story, but it's basically 2 young lovers. Pyramus and Thisbe are going to run away from their families and go meet and run away and be together, except Thisbe goes to their meeting place. She sees a lion there. There's like a little bit of blood from the lion's mouth ends up on her veil. Pyramus comes back, sees this bloody veil, thinks she's dead, kills himself. It's really very Shakespearean in its end. So, but it was fun to use really, really light white willow wood here, and then a little drop of bloodwood on there. So like whenever I can mix in stuff like that, that sort of like goes along with the story and is also something that kind of like is there for kind of the woodworkers in the crew, I always really enjoy that. And then furniture, question mark. So even though I teach furniture, I don't really make a ton of it that's functional. Occasionally I do. I'll show a piece in here, but for the most part, the furniture stuff I do is more about using it as sort of like a metaphor or a springboard for something sculptural. So you'll see a lot of these are pretty small. Icarus chair. So this ties together the Icarus idea and then also the furniture thing that I often do. You can see it has that same waxed ear with a tiny little cork plug in it because he's not wanting to listen. There's a maze on here. This one has a crank on the backside that you turn and the wings flap back and forth, which is kind of fun. Here's the Phaethon chair. So this one's also about the Phaethon myth, except this one, I think is a little bit, I would say that it's like I look at this one and think about how some of it's based on my father, who's a Vietnam veteran, and the bombs that I've made here on the base of this are both MK-77 bombs, which are ones that they used to distribute a lot of napalm during Vietnam. So I have this pilot seat on top, but the pilot controls don't lead to anything. So it's sort of like this thing that's falling without control. And then also there's obviously a little bit of phallic imagery in here too. So it's kind of meant to be like a commentary on how many really young people were sent into that war without much sense of what they were doing or what the end result was supposed to be, and how little control they had. And also sort of like a feeling about how you sort of like are pushed into something, and you have to like show that you're a very masculine person and be brave and courageous in a situation that you didn't choose. So that's part of what's going on here. Here's High Chair for a Ruler. So this one's about control and people who perhaps aren't so good with it. You can see this person sits in this high chair and they have this mallet and this megaphone, and they have this weird little handle here with the thing they pull, and it kicks with this boot. Melancholy Chair. So this is the first piece that I ever used glass eyes on. And that kind of has become a thing in my work. I do it quite a bit now. It's a small piece. Prospero Chair. So this is one that I did, another Shakespearean piece. It's based on The Tempest. If you know the story, it all happens on an island. So I have this sort of like tiny little body of water at the bottom, this little island that comes up. There's a spell book in the story. So I have this cool spell book that I made. This really, really tall, kind of grandiose chair with the sorcerer's cap, sort of like, you know, it has a very high Harry Potter-esque kind of feel. And then the two characters here, Ariel. And so if you know the story, some of this will make more sense to you, but it's a really fun piece to make. And this is one that you don't see it in this, but it all comes apart into very small, and it ships in a very small box. And I've been in a lot of shows, and it's very expensive to ship your work. So one of the things that I kind of take pride in is how nicely and simply a lot of these things can come apart and then get put back together, which is something that's invisible, I think, in the final view of the work, but in the practical aspects of moving it and shipping it is really important. This is another one that comes apart into a really small package. It's called Molecule Chair. It was made for a show for a gallery in Chicago about entropy. And the fun thing about this piece is that even though it is now, as you see it in this picture, a chair, it's made up of 72 of these little tiny chairs. So all it takes is pulling out one of those chairs from this bin and the whole thing falls apart. Each chair is exactly the same. It's like a modular unit, like a Lego. And there's very specific ways that they can be put together. So at the show, people could come in and take one of the chairs, and then once it fell into a pile, people could take things from the pile, and now they're out living in people's collections in Chicago. Oh, I didn't change the name of this, sorry. This is actually called Cicada Table. And my wife, Nancy, who's also an amazing artist, super talented, has done a lot of stuff with cicadas, and I think it was hard to not be influenced by that with her in the house. So I made the Cicada Table. And you can see it has a lot of sort of like bug-like influences, these long bug-like legs, the sort of abdomen-like forms on the sides. And it's made almost entirely out of figured maple, which is a really beautiful wood to work with. Cool. And then boats. So I'm down to 11 and a half minutes. So I'm going to go quickly through these. So one of the things that really powerful.
To say this quickly, like you've been going so fast.
Sorry.
No, it's great. It's great. And I watch everyone smiling when you're talking. The ones that I can see their faces are smiling. So I'm really enjoying that. So go, sorry.
Cool, great. Thank you. So my father was a commercial fisherman, and that's something that has really powerfully influenced me, like just being on boats, being around boats. And the Addison Gallery is in Andover, which is up the road from Lowell, where I grew up. And it's one of my favorite places of ever. It's just, they have an incredible model boat collection. I could spend all day there. So it's a really great place for me to go. H.C. Westerman, who I mentioned early on in this talk, was also a sailor. He was in the Korean War. He was in World War II, and he was a sailor. He was a performer for a while as part of USO. He was also a gunner on a ship. And his work is really heavily about a lot of those aspects of like what it's like to be in war. And so his work kind of like ties really nicely into this boat stuff. Here's a piece of his called Piece from the Museum of Broken Dreams. And you can see this really nice wooden form that he's carved so that it looks like it's being held tightly, almost like a, you know, like a sausage or a pepperoni or something, all carved out of wood. And he has this really neat little shark at the bottom made out of ebony, which is like one of his sort of trademark elements that's often in his work. I did a show one time called Jumping Off of Cliff. So Cliff was Westerman's nickname. Here's another one of his pieces. Carved wood, boxing glove, really cool. So these figurative pieces, like seeing these are some of the reasons why I think he's just such a great artist, is to make a choice like cover the piece in AstroTurf. At the time he did this, AstroTurf was a much hated material that people were pretty angry about replacing grass on athletic fields and other stuff. So to choose it to be an art material, I thought was pretty epic. So I made this piece directly influenced by him. Leviathan for Cliff. So it's one of his, except I've taken sort of like the shark fin here and made it much, much larger than these tiny little ebony sharks that are barely able to nip at his heels. And then just last year, there was a show about Eros and Thanatos at a gallery in Michigan, and I made this piece, Love Boat, for H.C. Westerman. So having shown you a little bit of his work, you can see like the layered plywood is there. There's a really famous story that Westerman tells in one of his many letters that he wrote to Alan Frumkin, who was his gallery owner in Chicago, where this one gets a little bit gross, sorry. But so Westerman did not like going to events. He was not like a big publicity or socializing kind of guy. So he tells this story about going to this party on Block Island with some really rich clients. He drinks too much, gets sick, and then he goes to the bathroom to get sick. Westerman was never out of shape. He was always quite ripped, even in his old age, and very quick. You know, he was building his own house by hand in his 70s, an amazing guy. So he pukes into the toilet, but then catches his dentures in midair, which I thought was a pretty cool story. Anyway, so that's where this denture thing comes from, and that's kind of like anyway, if you know Westerman, I think you get the joke. So you can see here a lot of Westerman-like influences. Sharks down below. He used a lot of brass in his work. He did these fist things. So there's a lot of things carrying on through here. Ship of Geniuses, which is meant to be a commentary on academics, many of whom are my good friends. It's sort of like the opposite of a ship of fools, where you have this sail that's made out of wire mesh that can't catch any wind. It only has oars on one side of the boat, and then the rudder is permanently attached down to some form so that it's like can only go in a giant slightly leftward loop. There's a microscope up front, which is about sort of like the very, very picky, like if you look at the PhD theses of candidates in, say, art history, you know, they like know about, 2 years in the career of Caravaggio so deeply that it's kind of something I talked about before. But and then there's an ivory tower up top that's carved out of taguanut, which is like vegetable ivory. It's a really interesting material. Boat for a Night Sea Passage is a piece about Joseph Campbell and the idea of the monomyth. So you have sort of like this boat up top and then stairs and chutes and ladders that kind of come around like this. There's a little bit of a light down here, like a light at the end of a tunnel. There's a Sacagawea dollar here, which is meant to be a reference to the money that you put on people's eyes to pay Sharon, the boatman, at the end of life. This is a piece about cartography and its power to go into a place and just kind of like start mapping it, and then going on land and then just owning it. So I think about like, it's a piece that's about imperialism, and there's a lot of things that go along with this. Pencils are a really interesting material to work with. It's hard to keep everything clean because they're filled with graphite and stuff that just turns everything kind of smudgy. Traveling dim house is sort of a play off the idea of a lighthouse. Part of the value of which comes from it being like stable in one place. Having it be able to move around, I think, is sort of meant to be sort of like a bit of a dark humor. You can see there's a bunch of sheep over here, and then these tiny little boats with angry mouths and guns, sort of based on sort of like attack politics. The next big thing, this is a piece that's about people who talk too much. It has these sails that are made out of tongues, these lead-covered lungs of the megaphone, and this is where I started to get into working with taxidermy tongues and other taxidermy parts. This actually has a motor in the back that's made out of a pair of chattering teeth. And having the boat made out of concrete, I think, was a really fun sort of humorous aspect about things that float, things that don't. Triskaideka is a piece about triskaidekaphobia. So each one of the figures in this is doing something really unlucky. This figure is permanently fused onto this ladder that he's currently always walking under. This figure has a cat walking across this plank that lives right on his upper chest area. And this figure is actually made out of a mirror. Inside this area back here, there's an open umbrella that sort of like provides power for this boat fueled by superstition. This is a planchette from a Ouija board, and then obviously a Ouija board down below. One of the fun things about this is that the Ouija board is a piece of chipboard, cardboard, chipboard that's covered in paper to look like simulated wood, except it's attached to a base that's made out of real wood, which I always thought was kind of like a cool idea of like real versus unreal, trompe l'oeil, sort of like a Picasso-esque chair caning thing. If you took art history, that would make sense to you. Climate change Plan B boat. So this one's, I had never really seen coal plants, like coal plants exist in Southern Indiana until I moved here, and we're surrounded by them here. It's a sort of, I mentioned the sacrificial zone thing. So right out by where my university is, there's a plant that almost always has really, really strong effusions coming out of it, like big, cloudy. So it's something that like is literally my everyday experience. So kind of the joke about this piece is that the Plan B for this like heavily based on coal economy / culture, their idea of improvement or their Plan B is to just do exactly what they're doing, except at a higher elevation. So that explains like the truss work, and it's meant to be a joke, question mark. Here's Flying High Horse. It's meant to be sort of about preachy people. So you have this horse, it's on these two boats. So there's some instability down below, and there's this throne, but the throne is also merged with the high chair. So it's kind of like people who rule in perhaps like the less mature manner. This all goes down together as a piece. It's environmental. So in this one, I have bone and plastic and wood and taguanut, and all those materials are combined together into this boat. And the boat has these gun turrets that are turned onto itself. The piece has this propeller on the side, and then several fins that make it so that it will basically just like spin in a circle until it whirlpools itself down below the water. But the idea of it being this all goes down together is that when you see the whole work as one, it takes a really discerning eye to be able to tell what is the holly wood versus the taguanut versus the bone versus the plastic. They all look so similar. So it's kind of like everything, you know, animal, vegetable, mineral, all combined together, sort of sharing the same fate. This is a piece based on the Popol Vuh, which is a Central American creation myth that was written down. And it has a sort of like some Mayan influence in here. And there's the basic stories that the gods create, they get kind of bored and they want to create these creatures to worship them. And one of their first attempts was these wooden mannequin men who were sort of like monkey-like and partially human, made out of wood. And they were not smart enough to worship the gods. So the gods got really upset. So they sent this flood basically of resin to kill all of them. So that's kind of like what this piece is based on. American Dreamboat. So this is one where you have a vintage globe sat inside of this walled off island, American island. And then coming from that is sort of like this big quote bubble about America being pretty great. Sort of the array here of smokestacks is loosely based on the Titanic. And then you can see the whole assemblage just walking on these tiny, tiny miniature crutches that I made. So I think the imagery here is pretty straightforward. Seeking Higher Ground. This is a piece actually that was at the Swope several years ago. So I was invited to do a piece for the Swope, and I decided to base it on Terre Haute. So here I have like a bunch of stuff at the bottom here. It's a combined together pieces of old pallets and stuff that I collected from Terre Haute. And then along this area at the bottom, I have this flow, which is kind of a loose emulation of how the Wabash River flows near the city or through the city. And then it's made out of sticks that I collected from the Wabash. At the top, I have some things that kind of like remind me of my drive up there. So I have this industrial aspect, and then I have a bunch of Coke bottles, which, if you don't know, for a long time, Terre Haute created tons and tons and tons of bottles for Coca-Cola. And then it also was the home of Columbia House Records. That's why I have this sail made out of CDs. So if you know stuff about Terre Haute, this one might make a little more sense. And here's Crow Boat. This one has a slate base, and it has it's sort of based on the idea of Charon and using money to go sort of into this darker place, sort of the underworld. The boat with all those crow aspects to it. Blood Vessel is a piece also about imperialism. So it's sort of like this Godzilla-like creature. So I imagine, like, you know, people in North America seeing like these boats approaching them and like not being aware of like the really highly powered creatures and voracious appetites that lurked under the water there. So I think about this as kind of like you would see this little boat floating on the water, but having no idea of the giant creature down below. It's armed with these two arquebus-style flintlock rifles, really big, hungry lion mouth, and then horses, which is kind of like about how kind of horses coming back to the New World. I spent a lot of time in New Bedford, Massachusetts. That's where I lived when I went to grad school. That's where I met my wife. So this piece is kind of like about New Bedford, and it's a whaling history. It's kind of hard to see here, but the actual base is shaped like the city of New Bedford in its current state. And then it has this little house made of whale oil canisters. And this is a sperm whale. It's impaled on these 3 harpoons. Carving the whale was really fun. I had lived around a lot of carved whales and whale stuff and whaling things, but never carved one for myself. So making one of my own I thought was pretty fun. And it's covered with vintage maps of places where the New Bedford fleets did a lot of their whaling especially for right whales. Here's a piece about our soon to depart president called Early Morning Fire Ships. So I think the imagery here is kind of straightforward. And you can see he's sending out these little fire ships, and fire ships was they were used by, well, actually fairly recently, where you would take a tiny little boat, fill it with something really flammable, and then send it out towards your enemies, and hopefully it'd explode on them. So these are little tweets that live on the boats. And here is the last piece I'm going to show, Sackler Families America. So this is the one that recently won the award at the Swope. And so I think since I made this piece, a lot of news has come out about the Sacklers, and I don't know if people pay much attention to the news, but unsurprisingly, they're getting off very, very lightly, considering the billions and billions and billions of dollars of profit that they've earned off people's misery. So this is just a map of the United States made out of these recycled prescription bottles. So I took the bottles, cut them apart, flattened them. Getting them flat enough to do this with was kind of a chore. They're very thin. You can use a heat gun on them, but they melt through pretty quick. So it took a while just to kind of figure out how to actually make the material not be a cylinder anymore. Just that alone was kind of a chore. Once I figured that out though, putting this together and sewing every one of the stitches by hand and pre-drilling each of these really became sort of like a meditative ritual to sit down for a few hours every day and sew these little tiny states together and really think about the impact of the opioid crisis on the United States. So the ways that it's attached to the wall are these little carved wood OxyContin pills, Purdue Pharma, and the color is pretty true on. And those actually become the nails that attach it to the wall in most settings. So this is something that I think is really, I think about how many people have been lost to this and how many lives and livelihoods and people now addicted to opioids. And it seemed like it necessitated a strong piece of art for such a powerful event. So that is my talk. So thanks everybody for coming. And I left 5 minutes at the end for questions if people have them. Please follow me on Instagram if you don't already. So anybody have questions?
Thank you so much, Rob. I love going on that journey with you. Wow.
Cool. Thanks.
If you see behind me, that's the way the gallery is set up. I think Edward did a wonderful job. And if you see your work right there. So what I noticed though about the Sackler one, so the image doesn't have the wood United States behind it, correct?
Right, yeah. I made that for the Swope specifically because I know you use that a hanging system that needed something because I didn't want you guys to have to put it directly into the wall and make holes in that beautiful old Art Deco building. It's so nice.
Well, that was so cool. Yes. So the exhibition will be up until January 10th. So please don't miss coming to see it. There are some questions already in the chat. Let me read that to you real quickly. From Carol Finneran. She's been enjoying this. I see her smiling.
Thanks, Carol.
She said it was Carol and company. She's pointing to him. I'm curious to know Rob's thoughts on the role of humor and whimsy in art. I appreciate your use of puns and absurdity in your work. And pardon me, but the art world can be a bit stiff and serious. I agree. What are your thoughts on that? Have you ever been challenged or encouraged to leave that behind?
I think no one's ever, I think maybe my graduate committee when I was in graduate school might have said, wow, Rob, why don't you take something seriously, once in a while, or something approximating that, but since then, I think honestly, like, I think, and this is something that I didn't realize until I moved here, that like, I think that, first of all, like, I have been really good about not swearing during this presentation, but like, it wasn't until I moved to the Midwest that I realized that people, at least around Boston where I lived, like use the F word as every part of speech and often, like they pepper it in everywhere. And I think that part of the, like when you, I think there's sort of like a dark humor that pervades the culture, especially of New England. Maybe that's because it's very old, but it's also, I think, partially because like, you either sort of like have to laugh at it or cry because like, when you get up in the morning and shovel 17 inches of snow off your car just to go to work or something, like it sort of like develops like a shell in a way, and humor is just a way of kind of like deflecting some of the crappiness of that aspect of your life, and it becomes like a lubricant among people in their interactions, which is something that until I moved to the Midwest, I didn't really like feel, I didn't really recognize or appreciate that. So no one's ever said, don't try to like use humor in your work. I find that like if I can't make myself laugh or like bring an aspect of levity to it, I get really overly serious. So thanks for that question.
Yes, thank you. Mary Lynn Stoll has a question. Why does Kant have eraser hands?
Okay, so he has some pencil hands and some eraser hands. And I think part of it has to do with like defining things by lack, and also the idea of I think about like the idea of intentionality in Kant, and how like how intentions can either write or erase the reality of a choice or a situation. That's kind of, I think, where that came from. I think that's like what I directly was thinking about it when I made those things. I'd be intrigued, Mary Lynn is a philosopher. I'd be intrigued to hear what she thinks about that or how she might interpret those things. But that's what I meant. And one of the things that I've done in my work, and I think I've been really good about, is like I have a very specific idea of what I mean when I do something, but when other people interpret it in other ways, I think that I see that as a bonus and not a detriment necessarily. So
I agree. Mary Lynn, do you have a response?
Sorry, it took me a minute to unmute. I actually sort of wondered if it was more about, and you probably this wasn't what you were thinking, but I wondered if it was maybe about how he thinks we can't help but to conceive of the world in terms of the categories, and how like we're erasing what reality is in a way, just in how we can come to know the world. But you may have something else totally different in mind.
Sure. No, that's good too. I appreciate your expertise, Emil.
Thank you. Rob, I have a question.
Sure.
When you're going through the process of making a work of art, you have very strong conceptual, it's very conceptual work. So do you think of the idea first, I would think, and then do you sketch it out and then make it into the artwork? And you use so many materials, and I think I heard in the video that you did with PBS that you add the materials as like whatever material is makes the message clearer or something. So you use all these different materials. So do you choose them as you're building? Or?
It's hard to, like, I would say that my process is one where I think about, like, for me, if you think about sort of like for me, there's always an idea almost always drives what I do. So like, I think about the object as an embodiment of an idea. So, so that's like, I almost always think like, oh, when I made this piece, the Sackler Family America, I was like, okay, I want to make a piece about that thing. I want it to be a map. And then I was like, oh, the thing that makes the most sense would be to make it out of the pills. So it's like all of the materials and all those things kind of like fall in service to the idea. That is not to say that sometimes, like the way the thing is made or the process itself also opens up other possibilities. Like that tends to lash out mask. Like that actually was Nancy's idea. So like I was making a whole other piece. It was a shell for a turtle. And she was like, oh, cool mask or something approximating that. And I was like, that's not a mask. And she's like, looks like a mask. And I'm like, oh yeah, maybe it's a mask. So the next piece that I made was that same exact thing, except it was a mask. So at times just being in the studio can be its own impetus or generator of ideas. But I'm more of like a person who like keeps a sketchbook, writes stuff down, and thinks about things. And that's part of the reason why I think I use so many different materials is like, I'm like, what would really underscore this idea? Like it would be, I don't know, making a stained glass window or using plastic or whatever. So those things I think sort of like lend themselves to making the idea richer or making it make more sense to me. So.
So when you're grading, you know, I see how well you execute things and then all the concepts. So if you were, for example, I don't know, like with furniture, it might be functional and more of the execution, but let's say the 2D class. So if one student had a great concept, but it was like, what is more important when you're grading, or is there a way to?
One thing that makes it a really like makes the grading easier as an art teacher is having really specific criteria and rubrics, because like, you know, like I could open, you know, Art Forum this month and say like, why the hell is that on the cover? It's terrible, you know, or like, I just don't see why that's going to be like the next big thing in New York. Or like I look at the, you know, like you know, Whitney Biennial, not this one, but the last, like the really famous furniture artist named Jessie Reeves. I don't know if you know her work, but the work's very, it's like really rough. I mean, it's like staples and nail gun and, you know, pink foam. And it's just, it's not made well at all, you know, but it's very famous work and it's very successful in what it does. So if a student has a really good idea, that's, I'll tell you sometimes in this upsets students sometimes, but I tell them, you know, like this is a great idea, but you executed it too well. Like the piece needed, it was a piece that needed to be about chaos and messiness. So like, I think like it needs to be consistent to itself and create a world that is believable and consistent. So like high craft isn't always necessarily an end in itself that is valuable. It can be something to serve an idea. That said, I really like high craft too. So does that answer any at all?
Yes, I find it interesting what you said about that it executed too well, and I will have to think about that to see how I understand that.
Sure.
Process it a little bit, but okay. I have so the one work that you did about Terre Haute, the higher grounds. Yeah, where is that now? Just curious.
Well, part of it I recycled into another work. So like this doesn't exist in its current state anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a pretty big piece. Well, I mean, I have all the elements to it. I just put different things on the deck and then put like a different rivet down below. And I didn't like the way that the high tension towers were made. So I replaced those with better ones. So, but yeah, it's, I mean, I still have all the parts to it and I could reassemble it tomorrow if I wanted to. So I do sell an okay amount of work, but this is one that was so, you can see it's, you know, 82 inches high. It's hard to, this doesn't match the couch. You know, like this is a big piece that's hard to move. But so yeah.
Okay, we have another question, but thank you for answering that.
Sure.
From Ashley, do you prefer the prescription bottle map of the US against the black backdrop or the wood cutout? Is there a black backdrop?
I think it has to be
blank.
white.
I'm sorry, blank backdrop or the wood.
You know, I'm kind of ambivalent about either one. Like I, for a long time made stained glass windows. And I feel like this against like a light colored background, it really would be great in front of a window with vellum over it. I think that would be amazing because I think about it as kind of like that transparency, translucency, and how it gets less transparent as the more layers go on, to me is the most magical part of using this material. So as long as it's white, I'm pretty happy either way, like with the United States cutout or with the white background. I'm ambivalent about either one. I don't think it changes the idea much. So.
Continuing on that question, it says, I just mean it's like grazed out and the shadow edging is different on the Swope display and the photo we are looking at in the screen.
Yeah, you know what? It is different because this stuff, the prescription bottle material, has gotten flatter over time. Like the image you're seeing right here on the screen, I think it's actually become more trained to be flat now. So I think it has less of a shadow behind it. So yeah, that's a very subtle question, but a good one. Yeah, I think I've never used this stuff before. I don't even know if it's archival, to be totally honest. So, but I think it's something that I'm discovering new stuff about it all the time. You know, I just made a mask out of it for another show, and it was really a challenge and fun to do.
Did you have to flatten the pieces somehow before?
Not for some of those. For some of those, I was able to actually use for like the eyes and the nose parts and some parts of the mouth. I was able to reuse the pill bottles as they normally are. They were doing what they wanted to do, which is nice.
I was trying to photograph it, and the shadow kept making it look like it was blurry, and I'm like, it's not blurry, but the way the shadows were hitting with the on the background, I think that you can see through them.
It's hard to focus on. I think the camera's very perplexed by it. Like the autofocus kind of looks at it and goes, well, you know.
Yeah, I agree. Any other questions? If you guys don't want to type it in, just go ahead, unmute. Let me see. We are past 7. I did get a comment from one of our gallery assistants, Julie, and she said she loved the Zoom presentation. It opened her mind to more than she was seeing. And she spends a lot of time with your work in the galleries, and she remembered all the other ones that you've had here previously. So it's pretty cool. That's good. That as an artist, it's really nice to hear that. Because I think it's nice to know that your work made an impact on someone and they remembered it. That's a high compliment. Thank you so much. You're welcome. Thank you so much for sharing your time and talent. And I really enjoyed it. And I was smiling most of the time listening and seeing. So I love that you have the aspect of comedy in it. Sometimes it is too serious, and several people are saying thank you. So thank you so much. Thanks to everybody. I really appreciate it. Everybody's time and invite to do this, and it's been great. Thank you. Cool. Bye. Okay, bye.